Yes, it is me. I wasn't sure. So yeah, I'm John Bingham Hall. I'm the director of Teatro Mundi. We're a research centre based in London, but we're in residence at Civic House throughout June. We're research partners for Test Unit, but we also have an exhibition there for a project that I'm about to talk a little bit about. It's a project looking at the provision, the design of different artist workspaces, and I'll tell you a little bit about how that came about, how that links in. I just also want to credit the work of a lot of my colleagues that's kind of gone into the research and the background of this presentation that you're about to see. So this phrase of cultural infrastructure is kind of a strange phrase that's emerged in planning recently, in urban planning, and this kind of piqued our interest. What is really the infrastructure for culture? It's really being used to kind of sell massive investment in kind of public-facing mega structures that kind of almost match transport and energy in their investment. But we wanted to kind of draw from this anthropological rethinking of infrastructure that sees it as a kind of set of underlying conditions in all sorts of forms that shape our everyday practices, coming from people like Ash Amin and Susan Starr, who look to kind of see what the social practices built into all sorts of materials and structures are. So we brought together artists working in different forms to speak with architects to look at how the city shapes what they produce, how the materiality of the city shapes what they make, how they make, the conditions of that labor. And we understood those practices, thinking about culture essentially as a set of productive processes, not just as a set of kind of objects or situations. And those productive processes having different materialities, the making of objects with materials, transforming materials from one state into another, the making of performances which are really more temporary comings together of bodies that have very different use of space to material making, which requires tools and long-term processes. And then the idea of virtual cultures, which are communicated via screens, on paper even, which aren't necessarily made or shared in any particular. Oh wow, yeah, it really is longer than you. They aren't necessarily kind of produced or shared in any particular kind of space, but they still have infrastructures that allow them to happen in the city, but also shape how and where they can happen. So we wanted to find out what were really the kind of infrastructural conditions for these different kinds of cultural production and the different materialities they have, and realizing that infrastructure, yes, it has material forms to it, but it also has immaterial forms. It can be code, it can be classification, it can be planning regulations, it can be social networks. But it's also what we call ecological. It has to do with like the relationships between things in the city, what your neighbors are, what supply chains you sit on. All of these shape the practices that can go on. And then the way that these spaces were designed, the way that these situations for cultural production were designed, shape whether those productive processes are made visible. Are they put on display? Are they in the city? Do they have long-term access to space? Do they happen in spaces that are purpose-made for them or that they have adapted, and who's adapted them? So having kind of developed this theoretical framework, we then actually got funding to pursue a longer-term project looking at real instances of cultural production space, starting in London. We're now doing research in Glasgow. That's partly why we're here. We have an exhibition. You can come and visit at Civic House. And we did a pilot study in London, a neighbourhood called Elephant and Castle, what was seen as a very kind of unloved but quite central area. It's a big traffic interchange, but it has a really interesting mix of different dynamics, different productive processes going on. Culture, but also light industry and a strong Latin American community that's kind of adapted a lot of the old modernist and spaces there. The shopping centre for et cetera, et cetera. God, it gets quick. And so we looked at a lot of different spaces, but I'm just going to highlight kind of three types of space. Essentially, these are all railway arches. There's a stretch of railway line heading south from Elephant and Castle, and they represent, the ways they've been used represent different ideas of culture and different ideas of infrastructure. So the first is a group of Latin American businesses in some railway arches. They've basically kind of adapted this space for their own use, cheap materials, breeze blocks at the front, kind of cheap subdivisions to create these little warrens of a mix of businesses, services. There's a jewelry maker in there, there's a clothes maker, there's food production, there's social space, very densely packed kind of little mix of businesses that have kind of built an infrastructure around them as they have as they operate. And then as you go a little bit further south from here, just the next set of railway arches is this kind of emblematic like idea of cultural, creative workspace. It's been designed expensively by an architect. It puts the inside, it makes it visible. It puts it on show as part of saying culture is here, even though these are kind of production spaces that don't have a kind of public-facing element. This kind of interesting way of making it symbolic as well as just useful. And it has this kind of much more luxurious use of space, and very light kind of, and mostly desk-based, and essentially it's much more expensive because of all of these expensive materials that have gone into it. And therefore it can't support the kind of like migrant businesses next door. It has kind of like design firms and architects in. And then heading further down, you have this whole other idea of cultural infrastructure that doesn't make it onto the mayor's map of culture in the city. This is the real backstage of culture in the city. This is the services, this is an audiovisual hire company in a business park who provide equipment for, oh wow, something's gone wrong with that image. Who provide equipment for like cultural events at museums, for conferences, performances, things like that, who are culture, but they're not creative. And so we're trying to break down these kind of boundaries between these different kinds of what is cultural, what's creative, and what's not. So we're continuing to do this research in different cities, looking at how different kinds of space get adapted for or produced around cultural production. This is in Buenos Aires where we went. This is the set building workshop of a community theatre. This is a kind of strange like car showroom that's been changed into artist residency space. So what I want to ask is, not just how do we provide infrastructure for cultural production, but how do different kinds of production materially reshape the city through inhabiting it? It's a very brief introduction to this research. If you're interested, we have publications and a lovely display at Civic House. You can come and talk to us every day from 4 to 6 p.m. We have an open office. Thank you.